all so much for joining us this afternoon, this rainy Seattle afternoon, for What's at Stake, a nonpartisan conversation about the 2020 election. I'm Max Bitashnik. I'm the Federation's Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council at our Government Affairs. We've got a wonderful program in store for you this afternoon. As many of you know, the Jewish Federation of Greater Seattle serves as the voice and champion of top community priorities here to our local Jewish community. And in the past, the Federation's nonpartisan election work has included voter education events, candidate surveys, get out the vote efforts, and advocating, of course, for voting rights in Olympia. And many of you have joined us in the past for Voting in Vino, which is a fun event in which we host pro and con debates about each of the statewide ballot measures and a candidate meet and greet. This year, unfortunately, because of COVID, we weren't able to host Voting in Vino. However, we are very excited to bring you this two-part conversation about the election. Additionally, I'd encourage you to check out the Federation's website for a robust compilation of resources on the 2020 election, including information about voting, a comprehensive debate directory for both national and local races, and the legislative candidates' responses to our questionnaire on issues like antisemitism and racial equity. And I'd like to give a big thank you to all of the donors from the Jewish Federation whose generous support makes resources like this and programming like this possible. So for today's talk, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers in just a couple of minutes here to give some opening remarks. Then we have a few pre-prepared questions that are a reflection of both the responses from our community survey, as well as the questions that some of you all submitted when you registered for the event. And then we'll also leave time for some live questions from you all in the audience. So if you have a question for our panelists, please use the Q&A function in here, not the chat, the Q&A function. So just putting that out there. And nextly, I'd like to express my heartfelt gratitude to our guest speakers, Jessyn Farrell and Rabbi Kahn, for sharing their thoughts and their expertise with us this afternoon. Thank you so much for being with us. And I'm going to share a little bit about each of them. Jessyn Farrell, JD, is a leader in building consensus on transportation, housing, education, and environmental issues. She's a former 46th District State Representative and secured passage of legislation on oil by rail safety, affordable housing, and protections for pregnant workers. She sponsored legislation to increase Washington's minimum wage and establish universal portable benefits. She is now Senior Vice President of Civic Ventures, where she leads key projects on housing, childcare, tax reform, and economic security. Rabbi Kahn is the Executive Director Emeritus of the San Francisco-based Jewish Community Relations Council and a consultant to Jewish communities nationwide on strengthening community relations, including the Jewish Federation of Greater Seattle. He served as the San Francisco JCRC's Executive Director for 27 years until retiring in 2016. And in that capacity, he was engaged in formulating consensus-based education and advocacy efforts on issues of vital concern. He has written and spoken extensively on topical issues, including presidential elections and the Jewish community. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll turn it over to the two of them in just a moment here. I wanted to make a note that during today's talk, we're not going to have time to go into significant detail about the results of the public policy survey. However, I did want to share top line that we're really excited that we had close to 600 community members like you fill out the survey this year. It's an almost 40% increase from last year, so we're really happy about that. And we do plan to have a special briefing on the results of the public policy survey itself and how we use that to create our Jewish community legislative agenda for the legislative session in January. So please keep an eye out for that. It'll be in the next month or so, and we'll look forward to sharing that with you. So with that, I wanted to share just a couple thoughts about the upcoming election. As I wrote in my JCRC director's note last week, this year's election brings unique challenges. We have COVID-19, which has disconnected us from our communities. We have extreme polarization amongst the votership. And many of the issues for many of us are both deeply personal and existential this year. And so, this comes in combination with unique issues for the Jewish community. Jews throughout history have often faced violence and persecution and been excluded from participating in democracy. And in the US, the well-being of our Jewish community is intrinsically tied to the health of our democratic institutions, and it's our responsibility to engage with and support these systems of democracy that have allowed our community to thrive. We know that an active and informed citizen participation in the political and electoral process is not only to the proper functioning of government, but also to the full exercise of our Jewish faith. And it's our responsibility as Jews to play an active role in our community and choosing our leaders. And it's been said by Rabbi Yitzhak ben Yehuda that a ruler is not to be appointed unless the community is first consulted. And so with that, I want to commend each of you for helping fulfill that commandment and for joining with us and for engaging with us today. We really hope you find it to be a meaningful program. And I'm going to turn it over to our speakers now for their opening remarks.
Great. Thank you, Maxim. I think I'm going first, but I'm happy to. Okay. It's a privilege to do this today. It's a privilege, an honor to do it with Jessyn, and having had the opportunity to consult with the Seattle Jewish Federation, I have just become such a fan of the quality of your professional and lay leadership and the rebuilding of a JCRC and what that will mean to the community. So thrilled to be with you today and looking forward to a post-election conversation as well. Let me start by giving a few reference points about the Jewish vote for president in the last several decades. In 1944, Franklin Roosevelt garnered 90% of the Jewish vote. In 1964, Lyndon Johnson against Barry Goldwater also received 90%. The lowest Democratic total in the last number of decades was in Jimmy Carter's re-election effort when he received 45% of the Jewish vote compared to 39% by Ronald Reagan. In '92, in George H.W. Bush's re-election effort, he got only 11% to Bill Clinton's 80%. In 2012, for Barack Obama's second term, he received 69% and Romney 30%. And in 2016, Donald Trump received 24% and Hillary Clinton 71%. So here's where we are today. A projection by the Jewish Electorate Institute in its survey last month concluded that 67% of Jewish voters were likely to vote for Joe Biden and 30% for Donald Trump. Among men, 57% for Biden and 42% for Trump, as compared to women with 75% for Biden and 20% for Trump. That's a 22% gender gap among Jewish Trump supporters compared to a 12% gender gap among all American Trump supporters in the latest poll, which showed 48% of men and 36% of women supporting Donald Trump. 67% of Jews in this poll disapproved of Donald Trump's performance, which was the same percentage estimated to support Joe Biden. But this morning, another poll was released, this one from American Jewish Committee, showing that Joe Biden has now 75% support among Jews and Donald Trump 22%. Asked which candidate will better handle anti-Semitism, the response was once again 75% Joe Biden, 22% Donald Trump. The only issue which was remotely close was Israel, where 54% said Biden would do a better job strengthening Israel-American relations and 42% Donald Trump. Most interesting is the difference between the Orthodox and the non-Orthodox vote. AJC surveys found that 54% of Orthodox Jews voted for Donald Trump in 2016. A JTA survey showed 66% of Haredi or ultra-Orthodox voters and 32% of modern Orthodox voters supporting Donald Trump. Last week, the Ami magazine, which serves the Orthodox community, suggests that 83% of Orthodox voters plan to vote for Donald Trump this time, compared to 13% for Joe Biden. AJC has it as 74% Orthodox Jews voting for Donald Trump and 18% for Joe Biden. With either poll, that would represent at least a jump of 20% compared to 4 years ago. AJC's poll also indicates that Trump is supported by 23% of conservative Jews, 20% of Reform, 3% of Reconstructionists, and 14% of secular Jews, while Biden, 72% of conservative, 78% of Reform, 93% of Reconstructionists, and 83% of secular Jews. So what are some of the issues that could explain the unprecedented difference in voting intentions? To speculate, For pro-Trump Orthodox voters, and probably non-Orthodox as well, key considerations might include a backlash against liberal politicians if one just looks at what's going on in New York with the mayor of New York and the Haredi community around coronavirus, inclination to see anti-Semitism on the far left as a greater threat, and a belief that the president has called it out, whereas the Democrats have been reluctant to, support for policies that are seen as protective of religion, which is viewed as under ever-increasing attack from the progressive community, and support for parochial education, perception of Donald Trump as Israel's greatest friend, moving the embassy and taking head-on the long-standing claim that doing so would lead to an explosion, recognizing Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights, nurturing peace deals with the Gulf states, and thereby, again, breaking the mold around the idea that there could be no real movement between Israel and the Arab world until the Israel-Palestinian conflict is resolved, and pulling out of the Iran deal, and concern about the direction of the Democratic Party, the Squad. For pro-Biden voters, Orthodox and otherwise, key considerations might include deep concern about character issues and threats to our democratic institutions, the free press, the judicial system, voting rights, etc., mismanagement of the pandemic and rejection of science, closer alignment on issues such as climate change, immigration, racial justice, gun violence, and the right to choose. Perception that Joe Biden is a solid friend of Israel, helping achieve support for the Iron Dome on an urgent basis in a 10-year military aid deal. Lifelong support for Israel and seeking peace between Israel and her neighbors, Iran less likely to get a nuclear weapon if the US had stayed in the deal. Concern about anti-Semitism on the far right with the belief that Donald Trump has fueled it through a failure to rein in white supremacists, alienation of key allies around the world, and coddling of authoritarian figures, and concern about the direction of the public party, for example, QAnon supporters embedded within. The other question is the difference among Jewish men. 42% of Jewish men versus 20% of Jewish women expected to vote for Donald Trump. I'll leave that to the audience to speculate. At the end of the day, I believe a key consideration or dividing line within the Jewish community, but not one that can address all the concerns, is the extent to which we see ourselves through the lens of a minority aligned with other minority groups around long-standing issues of concern, for example, immigration and civil rights, both because of our own historical experience in this country and our sense of continued vulnerability, or through the lens of being a minority whose interests are now more aligned with more conservative forces because we have largely made it in American society and are concerned that we are increasingly viewed with hostility by other minorities, again, a sense of continued vulnerability, who threaten our interests. Stephen Windmuller, a leading analyst of American Jewish politics, looking at a recent poll, concludes, in 2020, the majority of Jewish voters believe that the Trump presidency raises more threatening challenges to the welfare of this society and its democratic institutions than the benefits accrued by the president's actions on behalf of Israel and other specific Jewish concerns. For people who support the Trump presidency, the equation would flip. The pre-election survey indicated that the primary issues on which Jews will vote include handling of the coronavirus, Medicare and Social Security, healthcare, the economy, and the rise of anti-Semitism. Israel ranks very low. Translation, it ranks low to the extent that both candidates are viewed as pro-Israel, and both can make a strong case. I will state as a matter of disclosure that I had the honor of taking Kamala Harris when she was San Francisco District Attorney on her first trip to Israel, a JCRC trip for Jewish leaders, and spending 10 days with her there. By the way, 88% of Jewish voters self-define as pro-Israel, fairly consistent over the last number of years. And on the issue of anti-Semitism, compared to 4 years ago, 54% of Jews feel less secure, 11% more, 29% about the same. Windmuller also notes that most polling data identifies Jews as more liberal than the American electorate as a whole, 41% to 23%. Jews are 3 times as more likely to hold a graduate degree than other US citizens, yet while 31% of the general electorate define themselves as non-religious, nearly 1/2 of Jewish voters identify themselves as such. So how much impact will we have? That's a great question. At the end of the day, we are, on a good day, 2% of the general population, 3% in Florida and 2.3% Pennsylvania. In case you didn't hear yet, 2 swing states whose small numbers could make a major difference in a very close election. And as far as I know, the two biggest donors to the election by far are Sheldon Adelson spending tens of millions of dollars in support of Donald Trump, and Michael Bloomberg spending tens of millions of dollars for Joe Biden. There are other races, by the way. A big question, will the Senate stay Republican or will it flip? A question that has taken on even greater significance in light of the role in approving federally appointed judges, and Supreme Court justices, including the replacement, of course, of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. There are 10 states which are considered potentially flippable. Among them, 3 challengers have a Jewish connection. John Ossoff, running against incumbent David Perdue in Georgia, is Jewish. Sarah Gideon, running in Maine against Senator Susan Collins, is married to a Jew. And Al Gross, Alaska native, Jewish doctor and fisherman, is running against incumbent Dan Sullivan. If I were to handicap, I'd say Sarah Gideon stands the best chance of the 3 based on recent polling, but all are still deemed competitive. As someone who's devoted my career to safeguarding the Jewish future, I believe that wherever we are politically, there are issues of vital importance to our future as a community and country that must remain nonpartisan. First, our democracy cannot be taken for granted. It is being tested as never before in the modern era. We must fight to preserve our democratic institutions, from a free press to independent intelligence agencies to the right to vote. And the idea of American exceptionalism, which has enabled us to flourish in American society, is directly tied to preserving our democracy. Second, as Jews, we have a deep investment in the truth. We raise holy hell against lies against Israel and perpetuating Holocaust denial. And while there can be different perspectives on countless issues, some things are true and some things are false. We have a deep stake in fighting attacks against the truth and the notion of alternative facts. And third, we have a stake in ensuring that the center holds. We have reached a point where a huge percentage of Republicans see Democrats as a direct threat to their well-being, and a huge percentage of Democrats see Republicans the same way. As people are more drawn to polarizing views on the far left and the far right, the center is in danger of collapsing. We know the conditions that can give rise to violent extremism, which will inevitably threaten not only other minorities, but Jews as well. However passionate we are, we must continue to do our part to preserve a strong center. So let me conclude with 2 verses from Pirkei Avot, the teachings of our elders from the Talmud. So we're talking at least 1700, 1800 years of these pearls of wisdom. The first, be careful in your dealings with the ruling authorities, for they do not befriend a person except for their own needs. They seem like friends when it is in their own interest, but they do not stand by a person in the hour of his distress. The second, pray for the welfare of the government, for were it not for the fear it inspires, every person would swallow his neighbor alive. Together, they pretty much describe Jewish history in the diaspora, times where government was a source of deep distrust and oppression, and times where government has been the ultimate protector of our well-being. That is why we are so deeply engaged in political life and care so much regardless of our political perspective. We know that we can never afford to say it doesn't matter.
Thank you so much, Doug. Really appreciate that. Beautiful remarks. I'll turn it over to you, Jessyn.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Doug. That was really, really a wonderful overview of what is going on nationally. I am going to be talking about the state level, and I'll be talking generically about some of the trends in the state of Washington. I'll take a look at a few statewide issues, some legislative races, and I will also have some concluding remarks that I include. And I should also just say thank you to the Jewish Federation for hosting this today and for the role you play in our community. Now more than ever, institutions that promote civic engagement matter. And so I'm just deeply appreciative of everything you do. And thank you, Max, for moderating us today. So let's talk a little bit about what's happening in Washington state. The interesting thing, of course, about Washington is that it has a reputation for being extremely blue. When you look at our electoral counts, or when you look at our senators from outside the state, I think it looks bluer than it sometimes is when you take a closer look at the state of Washington. And in particular, I think that there are a few things that we should note about this particular election. First of all, turnout is already through the roof, and it is going to continue to be through the roof. There are some folks that are estimating that King County turnout alone will be over 90%. There are more ballots that have been turned in early than ever have been before. So there is record engagement this year, although we should really note that this is an ongoing trend. 2017, 2018, 2019 nationally. We saw record-breaking turnout also in Washington, and that is just part of this ongoing kind of post-2016 election era. So turnout is going to be very, very, very high, as it has been for these last few years. Let's talk a little bit about the governor's race, and I'll focus on a couple other statewide races, and then we'll turn to the legislature, which of course is near and dear to my heart. So interestingly, I think we have, as we all know, we have Jay Inslee, who is running for a third term. And I think most are predicting that he will win. And I think the interesting thing, he's running against Lauren Culp. And it is likely that the Republicans' vote on this will look more like Ellen Craswell from the 1996 race, or John Carlson, which were very, very low showings for the Republican candidate, about 40% of the vote, both Ellen Craswell and John Carlson. And Lauren Culp is expected to get this. And so I think that's interesting, because while there has been a lot of debate nationally about coronavirus and coronavirus protections, and there are debates at the local level in Washington state, I think uniformly as it is going to be manifested in the governor's race here, it is just not going to be the same kind of issue that it is in other places. And that's why we see Jay Inslee, I think, moving towards a very comfortable victory. There are a couple other statewide races, though, that are interesting to me, and I think might belie some of our bright blue propensity when we look at a wide lens at the state. One is the Secretary of State's race. The Secretary of State has been held by a Republican since 1964. So we have a long tradition in Washington of voting for Republicans. And Kim Wyman is the current Secretary of State and has presided over vote by mail. Washington is one of many states that has vote by mail. And it is quite possible that Kim Wyman will also win. I think the real issue, she is running against Gail Tarleton, who of course is the Democrat. I think the real issue for Gail, who I served with in the legislature, is going to be how big of a blue wave is there. Again, I think that is what's going to be needed to get over this long tradition of voting for Republican secretaries of state who support things that have oddly become partisan in the national election, voting by mail, but here have had broad bipartisan support. So that's one race that I think we should be watching closely. And again, are we going to stick with statewide Republicans as we have, or will there be a really big blue wave? A third race that I am watching closely is usually a sleeper race, one that we don't usually pay too much attention to, but that is OSPI, the Office of Public Instruction. And that is currently held by a Democrat, Chris Reichdahl. It has been held by a Democrat for quite some time. But this, to me, is where the anger is showing up over what has happened with coronavirus. Of course, most parents, including me, do not have our kids going to school. And if you look at what happened in the primary, Chris Reichdahl had around 40% of the vote. A Republican, Maya Espinosa, made it through. And there are a lot of folks who believe that low showing for Chris Reichdahl is in part because of anger and concern around the fact that kids are just not in school, and what a profoundly difficult impact that has been for families. There's a national statistic that came out in September that I'm just going to share with you. 1 million people left the labor force in September because of the pandemic. 800,000 of those people who left the labor force were women. And so in part because of the lack of kids being in public school, the collapse of the child care infrastructure because of the pandemic, the impacts to families are really hard. And so I think one of the things to watch here, while Jay Inslee isn't getting the ire of folks around the response to coronavirus, it is quite possible that Chris Reichdahl will. And there's quite a bit of difference between these two folks. I mean, Chris has a more traditional attitude and democratic attitude around public education. Maya Espinoza is running on referendum 90 and sex ed, and I'm going to talk about that at the end of my remarks a little bit. But I do think that that is a race to watch. Usually I wouldn't say, boy, really keep your eye on OSPI in a general election, but I think that that this one is going to be one to watch for sure, given just the widespread concern. So let's move to the state legislature a little bit. As you may recall, through the 2010s up until 2017, the legislature was split control with Republicans and a majority coalition controlling the Senate, Democrats controlling the House, and steadily over the last few years, Democrats have made inroads and now, of course, control both the Senate and the House. The Senate is at, is it 29 or 30? Somebody's gonna have to put it in the chat. And the House is at 57 Democrats. So they have pretty healthy majorities. The big question, again, I think is going to be how big a wave happens and whether some of those harder for Democrats to win seats, for example, outside of Spokane, suburban Spokane, the 6th district, is potentially a pickup that has been held by Democrats in the last 15 years. Another race where a big blue wave would really certainly impact the outcome is the 17th, which is outside of suburban Vancouver, which has been held by Democrats, but that is a very hard place traditionally for Democrats to win. One place that I think is really interesting is the 19th district, and that is on the coast, that's Southwest Washington coast. That had been held by Democrats since the 1930s. It was the New Deal coalition and kind of the resource labor coalition had really held on to those seats for Democrats over many, many decades. And in 2016, for the first time in a long time, Republicans were actually elected in that seat. And I think that district in Washington looks more like some of those districts in other parts of the country that went for Trump in 2016. So some of the trends around, deep economic dislocation, kind of long-term, and that kind of long anger at that not having ever been dealt with, I think, is one of the trends in the 16th. And so while the 19th is currently held by, the Senate is held by a Democrat named Dean Tacko, he has a really tough reelection race. And so while there's an opportunity, I think, for the Senate to pick up additional Democratic seats, it is quite possible that that is one that will flip to the Republicans. There are a couple other seats, I think, that are a couple other things to note just about the state legislative races that are really interesting. One is just the sheer number of Black Americans who are running, and particularly Black women who are running. It is unprecedented how many Black women who are in really well positioned, quite frankly, to win. Tawana Nobles in the 28th, that is historically a swing district that has been most recently held by a Republican, and that race is very, very competitive. That's one that I would definitely watch. And there are some other really standout Black candidates as well in this cycle. And so that's just a very different, that is a very different thing than in recent history. There are a few high profile Democrat on Democrat incumbent races that I'd like to highlight just for a moment. There, of course, is the race in the 5th district, Mark Mullet and Ingrid Anderson. Mark Mullet has been a moderate Democrat, primarily a moderate Democrat on tax issues. The big question in Washington state politics always is, are we going to be able to change our regressive tax system? And that is definitely an issue in the 5th legislative district where Ingrid Anderson is running against him. And one thing that's just notable about around suburban King County, particularly the east side, 15 years ago, so many of those suburban seats were held by Republicans. I mean, this is really recent memory. And now there are basically none. I mean, it's a really profound political shift. For decades, suburban King County was really where the farm team was for statewide Republicans, and the fact that there are no competitive Republican Democratic races in suburban King County just really points to one of the more profound electoral shifts in Washington and in King County in particular. So just a couple other things. I'll also point out there are a couple other incumbents that are facing some real strong challengers. One is Zach Hudgens in the 11th, Dave Hackney, and then Frank Chopp is defending his seat in the 43rd. And of course, he has served a long time, the former speaker, and he is defending his seat by Sheree Lascelles, and that is looking to be a fairly competitive race. And then finally, the interesting thing that I'll note before we turn it over to questions is we are looking at only one major ballot initiative. This is a state that typically has lots of ballot initiatives. The progressive and the conservative community use ballot initiatives to further issues. And the pandemic really curtailed the ability of groups and people to get ballots on the ballot initiatives on the ballot this year. And that's just not what anyone would have predicted. I think a lot of people were looking to 2020 as a big ballot initiative year, and that's not materialized. The big referendum that is on the ballot relates to a bill that was passed by the legislature requiring comprehensive sex education. And that got the signatures, and it is on the ballot this November. And it is quite contentious in the sense that there is a pretty vociferous, well-organized opposition to comprehensive sex education. And we can talk about that more in detail. I know we want to get to questions, but I just think the fact that there are that there's just really one major statewide issue on the ballot is very notable and very much a point of just the strange times that we are in. So that's a little bit about what's happening at the state level. And Max, why don't we jump into some of the questions that people have?
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. I learned an incredible amount from both of you about the national and the local and statewide scene. So I'm going to start with a few questions based on the results of our public policy survey. So this year, 99% of respondents to our public policy survey told us that the Jewish Federation should be prioritizing the fight against anti-Semitism in our advocacy work. And we all know that in this election season, we've seen more activity from extremists, an increase of anti-Semitism, incidents of anti-Semitism, including some popping up within demonstrations for racial justice. Candidates have been inappropriately comparing public health measures around COVID to Hitler and the Nazi regime. And popular conspiracy theories like QAnon are bringing new life to anti-Semitic theories on the internet and helping them to move from the fringes of society to the mainstream. So one question we have for the two of you is, what role do you see anti-Semitism playing in this election, and how can we work to ensure the safety of the Jewish community?
I'll try to, that's a great question, hard to answer very succinctly, but I'm going to really try. So I do think that it's not an issue, that anti-Semitism is not one of the identified issues with which Jews are going to go on election day. But when you do the comparison that 54% of American Jews say they feel less secure than they did 4 years ago, and 75% think that Joe Biden will do a better job of handling anti-Semitism, then I think that's going to play out in the polls. Interestingly, the broader subject of race relations was the number 4 issue for American Jews in terms of ranking the one issue that they were most going to vote on this election, with coronavirus, healthcare, and the economy ahead of race relations. So I'd say the bucket of racism, bigotry, anti-Semitism, a general sort of threat that's emerging from the extremes that continues to grow or surge, is a profound issue of concern. Related to that are the conspiracy theories like QAnon that you cited. As I alluded in my opening remarks, Jews who are much more worried about anti-Semitism on the far left are going to be inclined maybe in one direction. Jews who are much more concerned about it on the far right, maybe in another direction. My concern is that we have to bring the community together, that the more time we spend on debating which is worse, they're very different. Right-wing anti-Semitism is much more visible often and violent prone on occasion, whereas left-wing anti-Semitism is much more likely to be masked by other concerns. So they're very different. But bottom line is the more time we consume our energy debating that, rather than moving forward as a community, working together, I think we harm our ability to fight it. I think Seattle and the Jewish community there is very well positioned, having taken a extremely important statement on anti-Semitism, getting public officials to sign on, ready through the JCRC and the broader federation to continue to mount educational efforts in partnership with other Jewish communities. And one of the biggest concerns is if the election is unresolved and we don't have a declared winner, and it lingers on for weeks, and there's a growth of violent activity, then the likelihood that some of that violence may be manifest as anti-Semitism will increase, which is why Jewish institutions are appropriately on alert around Election Day and its aftermath. I mean, we are in uncharted territory in terms of the resolution of this election. And in any moment of economic and political turmoil and instability, the likelihood that anti-Semitism will not only fester, but surge increases. So we have to take it very seriously. And that's why the work you're doing in Seattle, reaching out to key influentials on so many levels, is so critical.
I would just echo that. I think the fact that so many Jews are concerned and fearful of anti-Semitism is absolutely borne out in the numbers of anti-Semitic incidences that are being experienced both in Seattle and nationally and across the state. And, we also know that the Northwest is a real epicenter of white nationalism. So there are some real very scary things that are happening out there. And then the question becomes, how do we interface with that in the broad body politic? And one of the things that's on my mind is, and Doug really said this, around the center. And I might say that it isn't necessarily the political center, but it's the centrality of our institutions. For example, media as an arbiter of truth. And, let us, there are always issues around gatekeeping and around, around the consolidation, say, of corporate media, that kind of thing. But we need to be supporting public policy that supports our media institutions so that they can be purveyors of truth. And specifically the things that are on my mind, one, supporting and rewarding strong journalist ethics and protecting those. That's something that has come up in Seattle recently with respect to protests and what protections journalists should have in covering protests. There have been lots of moments where journalists have been harmed in protest. I think media consolidation is something really important, but also social media and internet media. We have not yet created norms and policies and laws around online communication that is sufficient to combat the threat of conspiracy theories that grow online exponentially because of algorithms, because of the fact that, we are tending to listen to folks within our bubble, all of those things. And so we need a comprehensive public policy response to the issues around media that have arisen that are brand new issues. These are new things in the last 15 years, and we need to really champion getting behind how to continue to have the media as truth tellers, quite honestly. And then the second thing, I think there are some other public policy issues that we want to pay really close attention to. One is around gun violence prevention, and continuing. The Jewish community in Seattle and Washington has been very out front and engaged on those issues over the last several years. And I think that's a place where we should continue to really focus. And then, of course, this world around education and anti-bigotry and the great work that that ADL has done around connecting educators and connecting students to that really, what do you do on the ground when you see someone do something that is promoting hate speech, anti-Semitic or other? So, again, looking at how the legislature is able to support and fund those programs, there's been an increase in those programs, but we need to really continue to double down on educational efforts and other public policy efforts like that.
And I'll just add, because I didn't say this before, double down on relationship building with other key communities. I mentioned earlier on that on a good day, we're 2% of the population. We grow our percentage. We multiply our impact by seeking common cause with other communities, including other communities that are under attack by virtue of the color of their skin, their religion, or any other attribute that has made them the focus of bigotry.
Thank you both so much for those comprehensive responses, both central and then what we can do, outside of what some of us might think about. I want to ask one more question before we move on to questions from the audience. And this is, again, another issue from our public policy survey. So we all know that the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others have placed the conversation on racial equity at the center of our national discourse. With this in mind, 87% of respondents to the Federation's public policy survey said that we should be prioritizing advocacy on racial justice. We all know that many non-Black, Indigenous, and people of color are finally beginning to confront racism and the myriad of ways that it manifests itself. And conversations about race are happening at our dinner tables, in our classrooms, in boardrooms, when folks are there virtually or in person, and as well as in candidate forums. So I'm curious, from both of your perspectives, in what ways do you see the issue of racial justice showing up in this election, and why are they significant?
Doug, shall I go first this time? Okay, great. So obviously the social justice and racial justice reckoning that we are going through right now is one, the hour is very late to be doing this. Of course, these are issues that this country's been grappling with for too long. And so on the one hand, the hour is very, very late, and it is very urgent that we really figure out how to make our institutions around policing and criminal justice, but also around education and the economy and so many different things, work for every single person in our community, no matter what color your skin is. And unfortunately, they don't. The other thing I would say is that we are also in this moment where one of the biggest social justice movements that we've ever seen in the country is happening before our very eyes. And it's also really important. We're in this time where it is really hard to see the good. And yet the energy around Black Lives Matter has just been tremendous. And when you look at the polling on support of Black Lives Matter, in 2014, when it really kind of burst on the national scene, it was maybe around 40%. And now it's up above 70% for Black Lives Matter. And that's a huge sea change. And I really believe that if we want to change minds and hearts, we have to change what we believe. And so embracing this, this movement is really important and a really important step. Now, as far as how it plays out in the election, I mean, obviously in the national election, I would just say, the Trump campaign has been using the peaceful demonstrations as a way of absolutely creating discord between communities. And the way the protests have been portrayed on particular media outlets has obviously been biased, and I think with a point of driving dissent. And I do think that the issue that will be interesting to watch is how these issues, particularly around policing, which are local issues, play out in local issues in Seattle in 2021. I think that's where politically we're really going to see whether or not we're able to start to really change the way we allocate money and power in our community. So I think that at the national level, it is definitely coloring some of the ways the Trump campaign is trying to portray what's happened in big cities and scare people. And there's a long history of using race as a way of scaring white voters. But I do think that when we really zoom out and kind of get beyond the electoral politics of this, there is tremendous amount of energy and, quite frankly, shared values around this. And I think the building blocks to really make things different.
I think I just want to try and add a couple things. One is, I think that it's not only about the election. November 3rd, we'll have our election. There is, in a way, a kind of a cultural war, some have described it as, going on in our country. We see it over such things as the decisions around statues and what statues remain and what statues leave. We just see it as the painting of the issue as addressing systemic racism or preserving law and order, as if those have to be polar opposites. So, the positions have been sharpened. And again, I worry about that leading to more extreme positions. The Jewish community, for example, I think has always had a great interest in the judicial, in the judicial process, fair justice system for all. But I think that defund the police is going to go much too far for a community that has a deep, almost requirement and engagement with law enforcement to help protect our own community. So I think we have to avoid being sort of sucked into the emotion around it and continue to affirm long-standing values of racial justice, of equal opportunity for all in this country. And along those lines, Black Lives Matter itself gets sort of swept up into there. For some, it immediately gets pointed to as a movement that's including anti-Semitic elements and the like, and therefore we should stay away. For me, Black Lives Matter is a rallying cry, just as Let My People Go was a rallying cry for the Jewish community. And if there were 23 million or more Americans participating in protests, peaceful protests for racial justice in this country, then the percentage who were articulating anti-Semitic comments was absolutely infinitesimal. Now, when those happen, we have to call them out. We have to address them. But we can't be deterred because there's this sort of larger painting of a movement as radical, when in fact what they're calling for is largely analogous to what we've been calling for decades in terms of full equality for all of America, full equal opportunity for all of America's system, full justice for all of America's citizens. So I think we have to be cautious there. And the other thing is, I worry if we absent ourselves from the table, if we are not ourselves there, then I think we lose ground in so many bases, and more strident elements from the Jewish community may actually fill that space. So we have to be cautious about a vacuum being created. So from my vantage point, it's not only about what are the driving forces around race leading to this election, it's that we're still going to have a lot of cleanup to do and a lot of work to do in the aftermath, and the Jewish community has to be an active part of that.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much. Really appreciate it. We have about 10 minutes left, and I'd like to get to some questions from the audience. So I'm hoping we could do not exactly a lightning round, but lightning-ish, we'll say. Yeah. And maybe one of you could take each of the questions rather than both. So the first one, though, Doug, you may have something to add. I think it's probably a bit more in Jessyn's camp, which is, do you have any predictions about the race between Marilyn Strickland or Beth Dolio for the 10th Congressional District, or any thoughts on that?
Aha. Well, I guess full disclosure, I have endorsed in that race, so you should be aware of that. I would say that the polling that I have heard about is that Marilyn Strickland is ahead. Although I will say Beth is running a really strong race. I mean, she has very clearly characterized herself as the progressive candidate, although I would say that Marilyn, who I endorsed in full disclosure, Marilyn also has quite a record of achievement to run on. And, so again, I am watching that race somewhat from afar. I think they're both really strong candidates, but again, from what I've seen, it looks like I think Marilyn will be more likely to win.
Got it, thank you. And next question is on fake news. So wondering what you see as the role of the Jewish community in fighting fake news.
I'll take a stab at that. I mean, I think there are a couple of things that come to mind immediately. The first is, I think we ourselves as individuals need to be cautious about quickly turning something over that we hear without vetting it ourselves. I think we all have a responsibility to become personal vetters of information to the extent that we can. And unless we think we have confidence that something that sounds outrageous is in fact true, we should not send it on to others. I remember a number of years ago, sitting at my desk here, my wife was nearby and she said, I just got this email telling me we shouldn't give money to the University of Kentucky because they're stopping teaching the Holocaust. Well, I thought about it for a minute and this was an email that went to hundreds of people. And I thought about it for a minute and I realized, oh, wait a minute. I heard about this one course in one class where that happened in England, and a school district said, we're not gonna teach the Holocaust anymore. It's a little too controversial for some of the students in our class. Created an outrage, they ended up resolving it. But I realized, wait a minute, somebody confused UK, United Kingdom, with the University of Kentucky, and now hundreds of people were being told the University of Kentucky, when my wife immediately sent an email to the person who put it out. Was a correction sent? Absolutely not. So I think, first of all, is our own personal responsibility. Related to that, I think there are nonprofits now emerging that are working very seriously on trying to give credible news media information, that is actual software and other ability to be able to determine whether things are accurate or not. And I think somebody can do some research and find out what those are. And I think the third is for us, again, to see, as I said earlier, on a nonpartisan basis, that all of us, regardless of where we are, left, center, or right, as Jews, we have a deep stake in fighting against fake news. And what that looks like in practicality, I mean, I think we have to think about, but we should be able to build and sustain a consensus around that concept. I worry about it all the time because, much of the anti-Semitism we're seeing today is due to the stresses in our society. But I think part of it is also the fact that we are now 75 years away from the end of the Holocaust. And the stigma that once existed around anti-Semitism has been slowly eroding as we get more and more distant. And with that, we're seeing, fake news about Jews, fake news about Israel, fake news about the Holocaust, and fake news about things in our broader society and about other groups that should really give us pause. So I think those are some of the things that we can do. That's not a full answer, but at least hopefully a taste.
It's a good one. Thank you so much. I want to get to a couple other questions here. So another one, and Jessyn, this might be for you, which is wondering if the early voter count in King County might be boosted by voters' fears that waiting could result in a ballot being returned late by USPS delays. Is this something that you think might be an issue or other issues?
Yeah, I think that question is really important. So let's start with the facts, because again, fake news is fake. And one of the things that's really been pernicious in this election cycle is this idea that that vote by mail is somehow either possible fraud or that it is somehow less reliable than in-person voting. That is not true. It has been implemented in many states, Democratic and Republican. Ohio, Utah both use mail-in balloting, and it has worked very well. That said, there are real concerns, I think, that people have about the post office and some of the changes and the potential partisanship around the way the post office has been run in the last few months. And so I would say to that question specifically around King County, I think it is absolutely about turnout, but I also agree that people who might have waited until the end to vote, I'm one of those people. I always like to get all the mailers and the calls just to kind of see, what campaign is doing what. But in this case, I got my ballot in. So I do think that there is a very real concern that people are hearing about, what is happening with USPS. Now, the good news again in Washington State, you can do a drop box. And in Washington, your ballot is counted as long as it is postmarked by Election Day. So, it could be delivered in 2 weeks after Election Day and it still gets counted. But again, this is a place where, to Doug's point about fake news, it really matters because there have been a lot of there have been a lot of things about mail-in balloting that are simply not true, that are being purveyed as a mechanism for sowing doubt, which could play into what happens in the immediate aftermath of the election. And so strengthening those voting systems, but those information systems are very clearly related.
Thank you so much. We are just about out of time, but I wanted to ask one final question to both of you because it's big on everyone's minds, and it will be present at the virtual or in-person, Thanksgiving tables and beyond after November 3rd, which is how do we begin to bridge the partisan divide, the polarizing divide that is, facing our community and our country, both on a bigger level and on an interpersonal level?
I think the most important thing is that we cannot give up on each other right now. We cannot give up on the project that is America, which is to say ever increasing participation and ownership of our democracy. And that means engaging with each other. It means engaging with our family members that we disagree with. It means engaging with people potentially in our own political party that we may disagree with. And fundamentally, it means really being dedicated to our values of ownership and legitimacy of our institutions. Our institutions have to work for everyone, and we all have a stake in making sure that that's the case. So I guess my final message is we can't give up.
And I would say, I wish I thought that regardless of how the election turns out, that we're going to be beyond polarization. We're not. It's just the reality that we're in. And as I said, effectively, it's bad for the Jews. So I think, again, we have to do our part. I think organizations that swim against the tide by bringing together a broad representation from the community, such as the JCRC within the Federation, are critically important because it helps train a muscle that is we're losing. And we have to train that muscle again to be able to sit across the table and figure out how to talk respectfully, even when we vigorously disagree, and how to still find common ground where we can find common ground. And one thing I recommend for folks, don't go straight to the person who you know is just gonna make you so mad that you can't think straight or talk straight. Find a buddy, find somebody with whom you disagree, but with whom you can have that conversation, test your ideas, hear their ideas, and train the listening muscles as well. So we really need to figure out what are the muscles that have been eroding within our society that we have to build back up in order to overcome it. And I think we can, but it's going to take work.
Thank you so much, both of you. Well worth going a minute over to get those nuggets of wisdom. So thank you both. You are incredible experts. We're so grateful to have had you this afternoon. Thank you to everyone who participated, and thank you again to the donors of the Federation for making this work possible. Please join us on November 10th at 12 p.m. to kind of see how it all shakes out. And what that picture looks like. And you can sign up through email or on our website. And I hope everybody has a great week. Shabbat Tov. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.